Almost all of the struggling traders that I talk to think that they have a strategy, but what they actually have is only a piece of a strategy. If you want to be consistent in the markets, each strategy that you trade needs to have these four elements. The four elements are market context, or what some people call narrative, the setup itself, the entry trigger, and then your placement of stops and targets. These things may not be the same for the different strategies that you trade. What we're going to do is we're going to review today's price action and specifically look at two trades that I was watching today. One trade that I took and one trade that I did not take. And we're going to look at how these four elements played into my decision making in real time. Okay, so I have replay mode pulled up with today's price action so that we can see how these trades played out in real time. So the very first thing that we want to look at is what we call overall market narrative. So here's what I saw this morning. For me, market narrative is going to refer to looking at my higher time frames and getting a general context and bias for today. So this is my 50,000 tick chart. It's also very similar to an hourly chart. And what I see overall is that the market is, or had been pretty clearly in this downward channel. And this was Friday's sort of end of day consolidation down here. We created some nice equal highs, and then we gapped up at the start of this session on Sunday night and have been pushing up on very strong delta. This is a cumulative delta down here at the bottom. So we gapped up above this little consolidation structure and are pushing up pretty aggressively. So at this point in time, although we had been sort of trending downward for several days, this had been going on for some time, the market was pretty extended, probably due for a little bit of a bounce, and we are seeing some definite signs of strength here. Also worth pointing out that the market had made this nice lower low here, and on our delta, kind of flat, and then really rallying up as the delta made this very strong new high right here. The market was in fact still lower. So I like to see delta leading price like that at this point in time, although I'm cautious to the long side because we are retracing from this last bear move. At this point in time, I'm not seeing any signs of selling come in the market on this higher time frame. So the next thing I do for my overall context is I go to my intermediate time frame. And for me, I really need my intermediate time frames to be in the direction of whatever trade that I'm seeing. So again, overall, my intermediate time frame is making a series of higher highs and higher lows. We kind of came up, it's higher low, higher high, sort of a higher low and higher high, something like that. It's probably really more like this is what we should be looking at. So very clearly here, again, intermediate trend, very bullish. If we look at our delta, we don't see any major signs of selling. So my overall context here, my narrative is that this is a buyer's market at this very moment in time. Now, next thing we have to have is setup. Now, I was watching this pre-market. This time right now, by the way, is about 9:35 a.m. So right after New York session opened. Now, one thing that I do before the open is I look pre-market to see are any of my playbook strategies starting to set up. And one thing that I do, although this is my 10,000 tick as my intermediate time frame, I know that one of my specific setups, if it sets up pre-market, is going to be more clear to see on the 5-minute. I've tracked that, and I always know to look at the 5-minute for this. And this is going to be what I call my intermediate trend breakout momentum setup, because this 5-minute time frame is also an intermediate time frame for me. And what I need to see here is a channel just like this. So I was watching this. This is the opening candle. You can see we broke out. But before this breakout even occurred, I was already watching this channel and thinking to myself, we could break either way out of this. So this is the setup. It's setting up right here. and I need to wait for the breakout. I need that breakout to have strong volume. And of course, whenever this happens with the opening candle, we can expect strong volume. You can see that down here. But this is the sort of beginning of the setup. The next piece of this setup that I need to see is going down to my lower time frame, which is my entry time frame, and I need to look for a consolidation to occur on this time frame. I'm going to switch this over to a 1 minute chart. Right now it's on a 30-second because that's where I saw this particular setup occur. Okay, so on the 1 minute, we can see, of course, strong volume. It's right at the market open and very strong delta. And at this point, all I'm waiting for is a consolidation for this setup. And of course, right here, we get this first bear candle. So this is all I need to see for my setup. Okay, so I've got the overall context from my higher time frame and my intermediate time frame that I know I'm only looking for long trades right now. And then I've got my setup from this 5 minute consolidation. I've got the breakout, and I've got the 1 minute sort of micro consolidation. So my entry trigger is I need a break of the high of this consolidation, and my stop would go below the swing low, probably about here. We'll see how where the swing low ends up when this actually triggers. Now, this is the trade that I skipped, and let me tell you why. Because one of the things I look for in this specific setup is I like to see strong volume on this impulse, and then as we are consolidating, I like to see low volume. And although this volume is lower, which is very expected as the market gets underway, notice on the bearish candle, we actually had a little increase in volume there. That threw me off a little bit. I'm not sure that it should have, but it did. So regardless, I opted to not take this trade, but let's take a look at how this would have played out. Here it goes. So actually my stop could have been right under here. And there's the target. Okay, very, very simple. I had my overall context, I had my setup, I had my entry trigger. I know my stop goes under the low of the consolidation, and on this trade, I'm going for a 1 to 1.5 risk to reward. Those are the 4 elements. Let's move on to the next trade. Okay, so here we are at trade number 2. So once again, we're going to go through the 4 elements of our strategy, starting with overall market context or narrative. So here's what I saw. This is where we took the trade earlier in the day as we were rallying upward. We did make a continued push up. That trade actually kept going to the upside. This dotted line across here is actually yesterday's high of day. I always plot the high and low of the previous day, as well as the high and low of the overnight session on my chart. There's a green squiggly line here. I'm going to make this a little bit brighter so you guys can see it better. And this is an anchored VWAP from this sort of major swing high here before this recent sell-off. So the anchored VWAP is lining right up with yesterday's high of day. So a lot of confluence there that we might expect some selling pressure, which is exactly what happened. We sold right off coming on down. Now, this chart still looks a little bit bullish to me. However, we do have some signs that things are going to start possibly rolling over. So one thing I want to point out is that although we did make this little bit of a kind of a higher high, we broke this little swing here. We didn't break the more major swing. If we actually track this market structure, we have a lower high, lower low, lower high, lower low, lower high, lower low. So all of this stuff in here, including this little bit of structure that we did break, was actually internal structure. It wasn't the more major structure, which was up here. So technically the downtrend of this higher time frame is still intact. So we need to still keep ourselves open to short setups, even though we did have this strong bullish push. So that's some of the overall higher time frame narrative that I'm looking at here as I'm watching this trade set up. Now, going into my intermediate time frame, what I also see here is, again, that the market had come up and made these higher highs and higher lows. And then we came down and made this lower high and lower low. And we were starting to look like we were going to kind of pop back up again here. But what do? We slammed back down and sort of broke this minor structure here. So again, overall, that structure to me is looking pretty bearish. Now, the other things that I see here as far as overall market context is I look at my delta. I see that right here we have a little bit of a higher low on price action. Yet if we look at our delta, it is a much lower low. And when we look at our setup, we're going to see there are some other divergences there that are going to add to this context as well. But essentially what I'm seeing, I want to add also that the VWAP is starting to roll over and tilt downward as well. So overall, I'm looking at the narrative. I can see a little bit of an argument for both sides on the higher time frame, but I definitely need to keep myself open to short trades. And so the next thing I want to do is say, well, do I have any short trade setups here? And I certainly do. So one of my main setups, one of my top two setups, is my support and resistance bounce. So if I look here, the one requirement that I have for this is that I have a support and resistance level that has at least 2 touches. And we have that. So we have touch here, we have touch here, and we actually have a third touch here. And by the way, this was a tradable touch. I just actually did not catch this in real time. I was taking a short break from the market at that point in time. It was right after 11 a.m., which is usually when I take a break. So as we're looking at the setup, so this is part 2 of the 4 elements that we need. The things that I need for this support and resistance bounce is I need my level, and then I need to see divergences. So again, if I look at this touch here, support and resistance, look at where that is on delta. So very much down, okay? Even if we look at it across here, where are we on delta? Again, very much down. So delta is pointing downward. That's one of the second pieces of this setup that I look for on the intermediate time frame. Then I go to my lower time frame. And in this case, I was watching the 30-second chart. And what I look for is I like to see a little bit of increased volume as price is rejecting. And by the way, you can't really see, there's a dotted line sort of hidden underneath this rectangle here because this was also to the tick, really, also the overnight high, high point before the market opened. So I see a little bit of volume increase here. It's not great, to be honest with you, but it's not terrible either. So it's not really going to prevent me from taking this trade. So I have my divergences. Again, you can see the divergence very clearly here as well. If we look straight across here, and then we look at where we were from a delta standpoint, whoops, nice significant drop in delta, okay? And then for this setup, my entry trigger that I look for is a breakdown of price and delta together and sort of bonus points if I get a little micro structure break. And we do actually get that. And I'll show you exactly where it is. I'm going to set up an order so you can see how I actually would execute on this. I'm going to go a little bit in fast forward, so my execution may not be perfect. But right here, as I see price break down, that's where we're going to get in. And here's why. Because what we had was price moving up. We pulled down. We made one last attempt up here. This is what I mean by a micro structure break. And then we broke that structure down. And if we look, we see that the delta was breaking down as well. The delta engulfed the previous candle there. So that's my entry trigger. And then we can let this play out. Boom. And we get our target. Now, that was a predefined target and stop. Ideally, where I actually would have set that up would have been stop above the swing high. And then I was going to target this dotted line down here, which was a level where we had some large orders come in previously. So again, each trade, we have context, we have setup, we have entry trigger, and we have our stops and our targets. One thing I really want to point out is that as you are developing your strategies, it is crucially important that you take the time to actually write out the 4 elements that we've covered for each strategy that you trade. It is also essential that you take the time to collect screenshots of multiple time frames every time you see one of these setups occur in the market so that you can train your eyes and your brain to recognize them in real time. And I want you to get a lot of screenshots because each trade is like a snowflake. It's never going to set up in the exact same way every single time. And you've got to train yourself to be able to recognize the things that are important when they happen. And if you want to be a scalper like myself, you've got to recognize these things fast. If you guys enjoyed this video and if you learned something today, please hit the like, please subscribe, leave a comment for me if you feel so inclined, and I'll catch you in the next video.